So your book is about basically Christian / Protestant resistance theology. And you begin with the early church and the formation of the early church over against Rome. Why did you begin there?
Because frankly, the start of resistance theory, the start of ideas about limited government really begins with Jesus in the early church. Most people don't really get this, but it's the early church had a number of ideas that to us seem surprisingly modern.
Okay.
Let's just start with a historical fact. For 300 years, the church existed as a persecuted minority religion in the empire.
Right.
And what that means is that unlike every other religion or every other thing within the empire, the church was independent of the state.
Right.
In Rome...
It was against the law. You have to be independent.
Right. In Rome, everything was under the authority of Caesar. I mean, religions and everything else. But here you have a group that said, no, Caesar is not Lord. He does not have authority over us. Only God does. And we are going to stay faithful to him, even if Caesar opposes this. So what that means is that once Christianity is legalized, the precedent has already been established that the church is independent of the state.
Right.
And that was not true of anything else in the Roman world.
So for the church as an outlaw organization, it existed in that way for 300 years, which is 100 years longer than the United States has been a country. Right. So that's a long time.
Yeah.
Right. So that's time enough for an us-them category to get really baked into the Christian psyche.
Right. It establishes definitively the idea that the government doesn't control the church.
Right. Right. And because we functioned for 3 centuries without them controlling anything.
Right.
In fact, they tried to control everything, and we successfully fought them off.
Right.
For 3 centuries.
Right. Cost a lot of lives, but yes.
We did it. And then the fact that it cost a lot of lives means that the Christians will not want to give up that advantage that they paid for with blood.
Right.
Readily or easily.
Right. Yeah. The other interesting thing here, though, is that their argument was fundamentally that worship of God has to be voluntary. It cannot be compelled, because compelled worship is not pleasing to God.
Right.
And so they're actually arguing for religious liberty.
Right.
In the first centuries.
Now here's the thing that's really striking. A few years ago, I read through Lactantius, who was an early church father who was hired by Constantine to be a tutor for his kids.
Right.
Right. So Lactantius is connected to the court, and I was really surprised reading through Lactantius that he's arguing for religious liberty. He's arguing for religious freedom. Then I was also surprised in your book to find you noted that you put a spotlight on that. So the first court-connected church father is arguing not for mandatory Christianity, but is arguing for religious liberty.
Right. And what most people get wrong about the Edict of Milan, which is the thing that decriminalizes Christianity, a lot of people say, the Edict of Milan made Christianity the religion of the empire. No, it didn't. It didn't even specifically decriminalize Christianity. What it said is, we're going to have religious liberty.
Right.
And that effectively decriminalizes Christianity, but it was actually an edict about religious liberty. And the wording of it seems to have been taken directly from Lactantius.
Right. Right. So at some point, Christianity does become the official religion of the empire, but I believe you point out that that's
Theodosius I.
Sometime later. Right?
Yeah.
In your book, you talk about how Augustine made some enormous contributions to political theology in both directions.
Right.
Right. So, in fact, I think it was B.B. Warfield who said that the Reformation was a collision between Augustine's doctrine of the church and Augustine's doctrine of salvation.
Right.
So Augustine taught both, and they developed and percolated for a while, and then those two Augustinian visions collided in the Reformation. It seems that you're arguing something very similar on political theology.
Right.
What would that be?
Well, where Augustine went wrong is he backed away from the idea of religious liberty. He said that in the case of pagans, you can't force them to faith. But if someone is a heretic, claims to be a Christian, you can force them into conformity. So this is going to be the thing that's going to set up over 1,000 years of heresy trials. I mean, it was a disastrous mistake by Augustine. But what's really, I think, more important about Augustine long term is that he's the guy who really codifies the doctrine of original sin. And what that means, among other things, is that even kings, rulers, emperors, everyone is subject to sin, that they are going to inevitably move toward corruption. And in a lot of ways, the more power they have, the more likely they are to do this. And what that means is that no one can be trusted with absolute power.
Right.
Which means government must be limited and there must be systems of checks and balances in place.
Right.
We think of checks and balances as an American thing, and it is, but it actually goes way, way back into the Middle Ages based on Augustine's work.
So in his magisterial City of God, which he writes to Rome was sacked by the Visigoths, and that threw a lot of Christians into a state of consternation. And so Augustine writes this book to show the distinction between the city of God and the city of man.
Right.
The city of man is susceptible to sin all the way up to the emperor.
Right.
Right. The emperor is entailed in this, and so we need to be suspicious of those in power. We also need to be suspicious of our own suspicions. Everybody needs to be
Right.
all of this, we need some sort of firewalls everywhere we go. And so that contribution by Augustine is a true liberty-loving assumption.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But his willingness to force heretics back into orthodoxy was an unfortunate misstep.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so let's go ahead to the Reformation. It seems to me that a lot of the ideas of religious liberty that we're tempted to think of as uniquely modern are actually ancient perennial issues. We've been grappling with these for a long time, but they really come to a head in the Reformation.
Right.
Why is that?
Well, Martin Luther is actually quite interesting on this point because this gets into a lot of other dimensions of political theology, but one of the things that he said is that God has two kingdoms in this world, what he called the left-hand kingdom and the right-hand kingdom. The left-hand kingdom is government, the right-hand kingdom is the church. And God's authority is extended into the world through both of these means. However, the one thing that neither of them has authority over is conscience. Because we are only answerable to God for our conscience. Therefore, neither church nor state can bind conscience.
Right.
And that, although that isn't always practiced consistently by Luther himself or by his followers, the principle of liberty of conscience is something that was near and dear to Luther's heart and became an important component within many of the branches of Protestantism.
Right, and that's typified by his stand. Here I stand. I could, what's he bound by?
Yeah, my conscience is captive by the scriptures I have quoted.
Right,
and it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. He was rejecting the authority of anything over his conscience at that point.
When we look at the development of Protestantism, which we might regard as in the great mansion of Christendom, Protestantism is a major wing in that mansion. Protestant religious, political/religious theology emphasizes liberty of conscience, but the lordship of Christ over all of life.
Right.
And that means that in the absolutism that began developing in the early modern period,
right.
The divine right of kings being one example of that. The idea was, Rutherford argues in Lex Rex against those who say the king can sin against God, but whether he's sinning against God or not is none of your business.
Right.
Right. You do what he says. You just do whatever the king says. And if the king messed up, then God's going to deal with him at the last day. Nobody else holds him accountable.
Right.
Because he's the absolute monarch.
Right.
Protestant political theology is at war with that. Why is that?
Well, One of the things you have to understand is one of the reasons why absolutism grows and divine right of kings grow is because of the wars of religion that came up over Protestantism. So the idea is, how do we stop religious warfare? Well, if people have the right of liberty of conscience and can defend this and so on, then this is just going to lead to more religious warfare. So we'll go with this idea of divine right of kings, because that tells people that they're not responsible before God for obeying the king when the king orders something evil. This does not fit with most Protestant theologies. I mean, there are some people who will support this, but overall, if Jesus is Lord of all, Jesus has direct authority over us and over our consciences. The king does not have authority in that area. Obedience to Christ is more important and more central than obedience to the king.
And most modern Christians understand that when it comes to something explicit like preaching the gospel or smuggling Bibles. You know, most Christians would be good with the state comes to you and says, stop believing in Jesus or stop praying to the Lord. It's you judge for yourself. Should I obey God rather than men? That seems very simple, but when it gets out into other areas of life, like whether you should spank your children, or in China where parents are separated from the kids for providing a Christian education, or things like that. What would you say to those Christians who are nervous about resisting state encroachments over things that are not explicitly the gospel?
The reason that comes up is that Christians have a great tendency, it's really part of the modern world, to compartmentalize religion. Okay. Religion only fits certain categories. You know, it's about personal salvation, maybe it's about personal morality, maybe it's about something like abortion, but not much more than that. So what that means is you cede to the state authority in every other area except those.
Right.
But is that really what the message of the gospel is?
Right.
The answer is no.
Right.
Jesus talked about the gospel of the kingdom of God. And in case anybody has any doubts about this, in the last verse of Acts, Paul is still talking about the kingdom of God. It hasn't disappeared.
Right.
The kingdom is here. And the kingdom is everywhere where the king's authority reaches. So the question is, what is Jesus Lord of?
Right.
And if Jesus is Lord of all, which we say in our hymns all the time, then we have to recognize that Jesus' authority is over the state, that it's over every part of life, and we can't cede that to the state.
So in the last verses of Matthew, where Jesus gives the Great Commission, he says we're to go, disciple the nations, therefore go. Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, therefore go, disciple the nations, baptizing them, teaching them to obey. So our duty as Christians is to teach the king's obedience.
Right.
Right. And if that's the case, then it's not the job of the kings to teach us obedience. Or to teach us obedience to everything they say. The church's job is to teach the king's obedience to everything that Christ says.
Exactly, yes.
And that includes all of life, all of Christ for all of life. So the logical outworking of this is a Kuyperian lordship of Christ over every aspect of human existence.
Right. Yeah. So Kuyper talks about the idea of sphere sovereignty,
right?
Which itself really comes about because of the early church existing independently of the government. But in sphere sovereignty, what he says is that there are different zones in life that are essentially autonomous, that govern their own affairs under Christ.
Right.
The problem that comes up is when one sphere begins to interfere with another sphere or to take authority from another sphere, that creates problems. And it creates problems because it's ill-equipped to handle those things, among other things.
Or a sphere collapses, let's say.
Yeah, a sphere collapses, it implodes. And somebody has to then step in to try to do something. Well, that somebody is almost invariably government. And invariably, the government then steps into an area that it is ill-equipped to deal with, and not surprisingly, deals with it badly.
Right.
And this is actually the nature of, well, the title Leviathan. The idea is that it's like a sea creature with tentacles that extend into every area of life. What we've got in totalitarian governments, increasingly in our government, is a government that is claiming authority in all of these various areas of life.
And they want to have cameras mounted everywhere.
Right. Or you guys can't meet in church, or if you do, you have to maintain social distancing, wear masks, and can't sing.
Right, right. So if there was ever a generation of Christians that needed a primer on resistance theory, developing the Christian faith over against the encroachments of government, it would appear to be our generation.
Right, yeah. Well, the title Slaying Leviathan is really about the idea that what Christianity has always been about in political theology is limiting the state. To find those areas where the state has legitimate authority, but to define the boundaries.
Right.
And so the development of the idea of natural rights or universal human rights, Christian idea.
Right.
And it comes from these reflections on the authority of government versus everything else.
So Christians are not anarchists. It's not a no government position, but at the heart of Christian thinking is the idea of limited government.
Right.
Because only God is unlimited.
Right. And government has legitimate, there are things that are Caesar's. The government has legitimate authority, and we need to recognize and obey it in the areas of legitimate authority, but we have to be very, very careful when the government steps beyond those. And like I said, the Christian tradition has been working at trying to kill Leviathan this entire time, and unfortunately we're in a situation where Leviathan is coming back like a zombie.
Right, right. So if some of these issues are unclear to you, the only thing you can do about it is buy this book, Slaying Leviathan. Buy 6 of them.